Hi, good evening. I think we're gonna start. I know there are probably more of you coming, but hopefully you'll show up soon. We sold more tickets than this. Jenny's a very popular speaker this evening, so you can tell that you're going to have a treat in front of you. And I'm just so pleased to be able to welcome Jenny here. We've, of course, been in touch since she's arrived here. She teaches at UCSB, just down the street. But this is the first time that we've had the opportunity to have her come and speak, and it happens to be coincident with the release of her new book, which is right here. And there'll be a book signing, too, after the lecture, so if you want to get a copy in the store and have Jenny sign it, then we're happy to oblige. So think about that while you listen to her talk. And, it's so great to have Jenny speak about this particular book because, of course, it's so germane to our own cultural experience here in Santa Barbara and as Californians. And, this is a completely novel take that she's really kind of cut a new cloth with this book. And it seems like such an obvious thing since she's right that California anticipates what we call global contemporary in its inherent diversity. So that is part of what she's going to address. Now, as I just told Jenny, if that sounds exactly like something she wrote, this introduction, it's because she did write it. Unfortunately, I didn't come up with my own, but it tells you what you need to know about her. Jenny is professor of history of art and architecture at UC Santa Barbara. She writes on the intersections between gender, material culture, and contemporary art, working primarily on women artists and underrepresented media. Her books include Live Form, Women, Ceramics, and Community, Revolution in the Making, Abstract Sculptures by Women Artists, and this book, Art in California, which just came out, as well as numerous essays and journals and exhibition catalogs. She got her PhD from Yale, and she's a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Modern Craft. She was senior scholar in residence at the Getty in 2021-2022, just recently. And she also serves as the co-executive editor of Panorama, the Association of Historians of American Art. And what I particularly appreciate about this book is just how readable it is. So, I want to congratulate you, Jenny, on that, which is always an accomplishment for we academics. We tend to want people to understand us, though frequently it seems that it's a little harder than it ought to be. So I do recommend this book very highly, and I hope you have a chance to buy your own copy. Also, I should just mention that this lecture series has been underwritten by the Santa Barbara Women's Board this year, so we want to thank them, as always, for their support of the museum. So much of what we do is made possible by our Women's Board. Also, the lectures upcoming have already been pre-planned for the next 6 sessions, and actually beyond that. So take a look online. We have tickets available already. The next lecturer is Jan Ludovic Gutierrez, who is an Africanist coming to us from Minneapolis. So I hope you'll be able to attend that lecture as well. But with that, thank you, and I hope that you will enjoy what's coming next. I'm sure you will.
Thank you so much, Ike, for that introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming. It's very nice to have this warm welcome in my adopted hometown of Santa Barbara, and also, in our post-COVID moment. Things have been slow to sometimes repopulate and reopen, and I think that none of us take for granted anymore the in-person experience. It's a really important cultural experience that I think just cannot be replicated on Zoom. So thank you for all being here live, warm-bodied, and in person. Today I'm going to talk about my new book, Art in California, and also really do this from a kind of behind-the-scenes version of how I got to this project, and a little bit about what it took to get it out into the world. And why I've decided to do it this way. So many art historians, including myself, are trained on the East Coast. That is largely where most of the graduate programs are centered in this country. There's a cluster of them on the Eastern Seaboard. And so the narrative of the 20th century in American art has an extreme East Coast bias for that reason. And the 20th century is really New York-centric. And so what I sought to do here is really change the dialogue and push everything westward and showcase how California is a radical progenitor of multiculturalism, of ethnic identity, of community belonging and community building. And this has happened over the course of the 20th century through migration and exchange, which happens from the Pacific Rim in Mexico, what is called the second migration from the South, which happens during, at the beginning of World War II. There is a huge diaspora that comes from the South and settles, of Black Americans that settles in Los Angeles to work in the aerospace industry and help manufacture parts. It seems to be potentially the promise of more social freedoms and more financial possibilities that exist here. So something like 300,000 Black Americans migrate, and that is referred to as the second migration. The first migration, many of you know of, is the move from south to north. The second one is lesser known, and it's the one that actually reshapes the population of Southern California. And then the other big reshaping event of the 20th century is the lifting of 1965 quotas for what's called global entry, in which people who come from a much larger Asian diaspora in Southeast Asia start to trickle in. Larger swaths of Indian Americans, people from the Middle East, a mass migration of Persian Americans or Persians who come after the 79 revolution. And so there becomes a kind of much greater melting pot that most people outside of California are really largely unaware of, I would say. And so that's also what this book is seeking to do, is kind of retool and rethink. So I wanted to show you this kind of opening image because this is what I saw I've been here 10 years. And I'm a Californian by choice. I've resettled here. And like many of you, I'm guessing many people in Santa Barbara are not from Santa Barbara by birth. We are here by choice. And I would call myself in that category now. I've been here a decade, but when I first got here, there was this event out in the Multicultural Center of people with these ice blocks, and they were kind of building structures. And I loved that this kid was trying to take away these ice blocks on his skateboard. It seemed like such a weirdly utopian thing to do. And it reminded me immediately of this piece by Alan Capro, who was a really prominent and important performance artist and kind of radical teacher in the 60s and 70s, who helped establish the art program at UC San Diego, and then again a second art program at Cal Arts. He's a founding member of both faculties, and he did this piece in 67 called Fluids. And what Capro was really doing was experimenting with trying to make performances in which people, everyday people, could participate. And the idea was that you did that through lists and directions, everyday kind of writing that people could acclimate to, understand, and absorb, and decide for themselves with a certain amount of agency if they wanted to participate in these kind of zany and fantastical adventures alongside him. There are other people doing this work. Somebody like Yoko Ono was a big fan of lists. But Capro, who does start out his career and life on the East Coast, but comes west, did this piece in 67 that reminded me so much of that ice block happening, or event that happened at UCSB And so I always teach them together now, these two images, and this happening that was called Fluids from October 17th, 1967. And you have just the simplicity of the relic of this one photograph and the poster that he made with the drawing, in which he says what happens. During 3 days, about 20 rectangular enclosures of ice blocks measuring about 30 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 8 feet high are built throughout the city of Los Angeles. Their walls are unbroken. They are left to melt. So we know Southern California is hot. We know that this is a kind of odd kind of event to partake in, and that you would have to really want to do it because you knew the whole thing was going to melt by the end, hence the title Fluids. And so he is considered the original thinker and inventor of the term happening, which I pulled out for you at the bottom of the screen, which is a live art event without a narrative structure. So there's no narrative here, but there are participants. They are people off the street. They are students. And they came together in this communal way to build these rectangular ice structures that everybody knew what was going to happen at the end because of the title of the piece, Fluids. Another piece, I have a habit of taking images on campuses I see, especially when things are being utilized wrongly or in a comical way like this. This is a kind of minimalist sculpture that was built on Cal State Long Beach's campus as part of a 1965 international symposium. They have sculpture dotted all over, and this was a kind of we might say a Canadian artist who was really a bit derivative. He's looking at a lot of minimalism. Certainly, his piece was not meant to be used as a skateboard platform. But again, it's a kind of, it's there for the taking. Nobody's looking. I was there on a Saturday. This is a what not to do with a minimalist sculpture on your campus. But what this kid who's skateboarding and what most of his contemporaries and even art people in Southern California don't know is that this piece is really based on a kind of West Coast minimalism that's often called Finnish fetish. It's a kind of 60s era, much more potently colorful form of minimalism. You see here both in John McCracken, that's kind of a baby pink, and then Judy Chicago's rainbow picket, which are planks that are wrapped in canvas and sanded down and painted in these bright matte pastel colors. And Finnish, the reason the movement out west is called not minimalism, but Finnish fetish is because it's a movement that prizes the surface and this kind of bright, rich, sunny California color, and simultaneously the erasure of the hand. There is no hand, there's no residue of the artist's fingerprints. All of that is sanded away in order to look as industrial as possible, which is essentially the fetishization of the Finnish, we might say. So what I'm hoping to do, or what I've aimed to do in this book, is partake in a kind of social art history, and I call myself a social art historian because I'm much less concerned about the color and the technique, although I can do all that, than the undercurrents of the sort of social and political structures in which an artwork is conceived. How is an artist uniquely fit into and are of their time and place, that nobody is really working in a void. Even people who want to be working in isolation are never truly working in isolation. It's a kind of myth. And so I take that kind of social art history and apply what's called revisionism. This is a kind of loose term, but it's about the reinterpretation of the historical record, in which we seek to change traditional views and ideas by adding in people, events, and histories who were present but remained consistently overlooked. Who are those people? They are most often women and people of color, because the art world has privileged and still continues to privilege production by white men and white people in general. So I pitched this book to this very famous series called The World of Art. It's a British series that's been running for a good part of since the 20s, but in earnest since the 60s. These are paperbacks. They have no footnotes. They're meant to try to offer a well-written and articulate summary, but in everyday language so that anybody can pick these up, where you don't have to be an art historian or a student of art history. You just have to be interested in the subject matter. And you can see by these titles that it's usually a huge swath of history that's covered. Art of all the Middle Ages, art of the Celts, art of Southeast Asia. We do have an art since 1989, that's a newer one. And they did medium-specific surveys for a while. They did furniture, they did jewelry, they did ceramics. They've even done subject-specific surveys. They did Black art cultural history that was just recently revised. They've done a design since 1945. When I pitched this, my British editor was really skeptical, and he said, Californian art. Californian. And I said, no, we're not saying the Californian art. I said, art of California. And he's like, but that's just a state. It's a single state. How could we possibly publish? What could there possibly be to say about California that's not been said about Hollywood? And I said, oh, it's way more than Hollywood. It's more interesting than Hollywood. The other investment that I had in being part of this series, once they molded over and decided that they might be interested in a single state, but were anxious about the idea that if I did a single state, were other people going to start pitching quote unquote less interesting states? The ones he named were North Carolina. He was very proud of himself for knowing North Carolina. And the art, and he said, and those Dakotas. But part of the joy of this series is that they reissue in editions. And so when or if it's adopted as a survey text for courses, which is much less usual than you might think these days because people don't actually assign full textbooks anymore, but it does happen, is that you have the chance to update and revise in order to keep the book feeling fresh and relevant. And as a contemporary art historian who works into the present, it's really important where I have colleagues who work on past big swaths of history like Northern Renaissance, who for 10 years for them doesn't mean the same thing that 10 years does to me. 10 years is quite topical, and things changed dramatically between 2011 and 2021. In that period, we had COVID. If people were to start painting, figure paintings that show up with, everybody's in a mask, everybody will instantly be able to date that. There'll be a kind of, specificity of the era that we could always pick out, for instance, because the mask is now so prevalent from the last 3 years. But before that, it was not part of our lives at all. And so we know that it would always date to 2020, or I guess to our current period, 2023 even. So when I wrote this book proposal, I actually began here with Mexican muralism. These are the three artists known as Los Tres Grandes, or the three greats, Jose Clemente Orozco, Diego Rivera, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. I, like many people, have been intrigued by the fact that there were many murals produced during this very tightly compressed era of 1930 to 1932 in the state of California. There has been a kind of revolution on the East Coast, again on the East Coast, of people rethinking the history of muralism from an East Coast perspective, in which all of the murals on the West Coast here in California have been kind of routinely denigrated as secondary, as not as important, as overlooked, but they were kind of early renditions that happened before. And it is true that Orozco does Prometheus here at Ferry Hall at Pomona's campus. This is the first thing he does in the United States. It turns out he was never paid for this mural. The money was raised by a student group. It was a kind of illicit commission by an adjunct professor who leaves shortly after the commission is completed. And in the papers, the artist is begging for his money and he never sees it. This is also the era of the Great Depression. And so the Depression affected Mexico just as much as it affected the United States, if not more, because people were more poverty-stricken south of the border. And the commission process in Mexico dried up, and these three artists came north looking for opportunity. This is Diego Rivera's The Making of a Fresco, showing the building of a city, which is about the rise of San Francisco. This one has been quite a lot in the news. If you've been following the closure of the San Francisco Art Institute, which has just closed over the summer, and there's been a lot of battle about what to do with this mural, which is a fresco that's embedded in the wall of the building. So that's still an undecided situation. We can talk more about that later, if you'd like. And then there's this last one, which is instantly recognizable to all of you, but maybe you haven't seen the original picture here. And this is Siqueiros's mural. This is the only one still fully in existence in the state of California, in which Siqueiros, in exchange for shelter and a place, food, and a place to sort of hide out from the INS because his visa had expired and he didn't want to be sent back because he was a kind of guerrilla figure who'd already been jailed for political activity in Mexico several times, is hiding out in the Pacific Palisades at a little known, but at the time fairly famous film director named Dudley Murphy. And in exchange for his room and board and shelter and that of his wife and child, he ends up painting Portrait of Mexico Today in this garden portico. And the Schiffer Goldman, who is really the primary Latin Americanist who documents Siqueiros's activities in the United States and in Mexico. She was one of the foremost Latin Americanists, eager to capture him on record. You see this picture of her going to visit him toward the end of his life in the 70s. Schiffer Goldman was trained, she was a Russian Jew who ends up doing labor movement before she goes to graduate school. She's a labor activist, so she's really committed to the kind of labor politics and the proletariat communism of the Mexican muralists. They were all card-carrying members of the Communist Party. They were all seriously committed socialists. Schiffer Goldman ends up donating her papers to the California Ethnic and Multicultural Archives called CIMA that are held at special collections here in town at UCSB. And what she writes to Diana DuPont, who was then the curator of modern and contemporary art here at Santa Barbara in 1998, housing this mural is equivalent to encountering and restoring to its proper phase and place an important early Cézanne or early Picasso of a large size. Your proposal to preserve this work and make it available to the public for the first time in 60 plus years is not only logical, but visionary. Is anybody here in the audience here at the time that this mural was transported? Oh, a couple of you, a bunch of you actually. So maybe some of you had this look on your face. This is former director Robert Frankel and exhibition designer Dane Goodman watching as the mural was craned into place. It was transported on a big truck early Thursday morning of October 11th, 2001, and this is what it looked like. And my students, and maybe some of you too, are stunned that we have this treasure at our disposal here, and that the museum has made it free. There's a good lock on it when museum hours are closed, but that anybody can go visit and walk into this portico as it was fully preserved, because the fresco painting means that you are literally embedding the paint and the pigments within the surface of the concrete itself, or the texture of the wall. So they cannot be, the image cannot be lifted off the wall. The wall and the image are one, otherwise you destroy the mural. And so all of that was craned in, and it is now here. And this is really the last remaining vestige of Chicanx. There is one more downtown on Olvera Street. That was the original Chicanx that was whitewashed immediately, almost immediately after it was made. It's on the side of a building very high up. There is a kind of restructuring. The Getty spent a lot of money to try to preserve this at Schiffer Goldman's urging, but the real preservation happens because of this museum. And because of Diana DuPont's hard work, and because of the fundraising that happened in this community in order to preserve this mural. So this, to me, is this really moving thing that this community, which is not a terribly big city, managed to band together and preserve this and make this essentially a massively public work that people could otherwise not see. And so this is something that I teach every time I teach this class, but I teach it anyway because I want students who are largely all from California for the most part. There's a smattering of international students, but 98% of my students here at UCSB are Californians. For some of them, this is the biggest place they've ever lived. Many of them come from rural parts of the state, from farming communities in the Central Valley, and this becomes something that they take their parents to at graduation. I find it very moving. I get choked up about it, but it's like, you know, to me that's something really important that they're able to feel pride in. So Mexican muralism set the stage for an endless array of mural projects throughout California. We have them here in parts of Santa Barbara. There's 70s murals in Ortega Park you can still see. There's one from 73 that's very prominent outside of the Student Center at SBCC. They're dotted around the east side of our city, but they're also all over the state, largely in urban centers where there are large Hispanic communities. One of the biggest is Chicano Park in San Diego, which is kind of an ongoing project. This is the Women's Building that was a mural project done in '94 in the Mission District in the Bay Area. And if you walk the Mission District, there are still muralist tours you can take because there's a kind of ongoing commitment to making and beautifying urban areas of San Francisco, of that particular neighborhood, and other cities around. Salinas has murals, but murals are also one of the easiest public art programs to sort of commission and get people inspired and invested. And we can say that this really starts because artists are so committed to the sort of Mexican muralist ideal, which is of the people, for the people, and is really about uplifting the worker early on. But when I began writing this book, I realized I actually needed to start earlier if I wanted to be truly diverse and as inclusive as possible. So I actually went back and started a generation earlier. I thought I was starting this book in 1929 when Orozco first came to California, and I decided to go back a generation so that I could include this group of Japanese American photographers who were all modernists and who are making the most beautiful and exquisite abstract prints that you see here, who have largely become completely lost to history because they faced deportation to concentration camps and internment camps, and they end up losing their small businesses, which are largely photographic studios in Little Tokyo, in Japantown, in Sacramento, and that is where they cluster in groups and form camera clubs, which is the amateur way at sort of the era of the beginning of the 20th century to the first quarter of the century, let's say about 1900 to about 1925. That's the only way you learn photography is from your peers. There is no way to take a photo class. Photography is this newfangled technology that people are really excited about and playing with. And it's also the first way to capture middle-class portraiture. And so people are willing to pay for images of their family, particularly on important occasions like weddings, like graduations, like baby namings, christenings, and that sometimes that's why we only have a few precious pictures of former generations in our own families, is because that's the only way we know what they look like, is because they have a wedding picture. Like, I only know what my great-grandmother looks like from her wedding photograph, because she went to an actual portrait studio and posed for a picture. And that was how the immigrant community also self-documented when they had a little bit of money to celebrate these milestones in their own families when they came to this country. And so I went back to this earlier generation, and it turns out that there was interaction between white photographers and Japanese-American photographers. Edward Weston does a show in Little Tokyo. He's invited in. People are very interested in his prints. So there is Diego Rivera, when he's in San Francisco, speaks to a group of Chinese painters. Nobody really can speak to each other, but they're all gesturing and showing each other work. And so there is this kind of early investment in multiculturalism and in breaking barriers in California that I think is so important. Simultaneous to this photography revolution that happens here, there is still what we call plein air painting that happens. This is French for outdoors. This is the responsiveness to conditions of natural light, strongly influenced by French Impressionism, which if you go outside, our collection here is rich in that. It spawns a movement known as California Impressionism, which took hold in seaside and desert art colonies, including Laguna and Carmel and Palm Springs, and of course here in Santa Barbara. And just to show you that plein air painting has not gone away, I took this picture of an easel painter at Coal Oil Point just this past September. So we still have strong and firm inclinations toward Impressionism locally. But simultaneously, this kind of California Impressionism and early photography is happening, a kind of older form of capturing the light and a newer form of capturing the light. And they're layered. And for some reason, art history is this really conservative discipline that separates painting and photography. You either write on painting or you write on photography. I consider myself a generalist who can write on anything, and so my secret desire was to merge these, put painting and photography together, and so that's what I did in this book. This is where the book opens, with this date of 1916. And I chose this date because this is the year that the National Park Service takes over all of California's state parks. So this is when effectively Yosemite and Joshua Tree and Sequoia all become nationally prized treasures. And what that means is they become much more accessible because federal funding is there to pave and to blaze trails and to make it accessible to tourists who are coming out west on the railroad. It means driving out an Indian population, which I'll get to in the next slide, but it also means access for artists who are really excited to paint and photograph their way through places like Yosemite. And so Ansel Adams is one of these photographers, and this is a Yosemite shot, who's familiar to all of us, now to the point sometimes of ad nauseum, because these are the soothing pictures you see in doctors' offices in the waiting room. It's kind of Ansel Adams overkill, but early on they were really sublime images. Nobody had made this kind of majestic imagery within the parks. And Ansel Adams is the first official photographer of the Sierra Club, which is a very early environmental group. He hikes with them, he documents their doings, and he also schleps all this camera equipment and mules to get himself the right perfect image. But he's not the only person going on these hikes. Churia Obada, who is a Japanese-born immigrant artist who was the first artist of color hired at Berkeley as an instructor, is also doing that. He's going on hikes and he is making beautiful drawings and he's merging a kind of Eastern sensibility with Western colors. And he makes color woodcuts, he does silk painting, and he has a big show at the Palace of Legion of Honor in 1931. And you see him here wearing a kimono and a kind of Eastern style of dress. But this is somebody who, during the internment, the Japanese-American internment of World War II, loses his job and his livelihood. And this is a man who lives through, early on when he gets here, he lived through the earthquake. Ansel Adams also lives through the earthquake, so they're kind of in parallel but don't know each other. And Obada eventually gets his job back, but while he is in these concentration camps and incarcerated at Tanforan and later at Poznan, or Topaz, he ends up starting an art school for children up through adults so that people can have a kind of solace in their practice, in their everyday life, that they can still produce images of beauty. And so he teaches people to draw and paint on whatever scraps of paper that they can find. And he teaches something like 12 classes a day for whatever years he was interned throughout the entirety of the war, something like 4 or 5 years. And he does this with a group of other artists. And then he goes back to his job at Berkeley. He's given back his job at Berkeley. But he's been a really under-recognized California original for a long time. And his work lives mostly in collections in the Bay Area, but some of it still with his family. And finally, there was a big show in 2018 that originates at our campus museum that traveled to the Smithsonian, that Shipu Wang, who was a graduate of UC Santa Barbara and teaches at Merced, organized. And so this was really the first time anybody took till 2018 to examine his oeuvre, or the body of his work. And so I put these two artists in dialogue together in the first chapter, which I call Vistas and Visions, Landscape and Ethnicity in Modernist Painting and Photography. And the last piece of my beginning date of 1916 is, the first piece of it is the National Park Service taking over California parks. The second piece of it is, it's the death of Carlton Watkins, who's really the kind of enterprising capitalist photographer who makes his way to California and does beautiful Yosemite landscapes, is working on a geological survey, but simultaneously moonlighting for all the oil companies. He doesn't care who he photographs for. He'll take anybody's money. So there's a lot of early oil rigs that he also does, and kind of industry shots. He dies that year, and he is who actually precedes Adams, but is much less well-known than Ansel Adams. And then the last piece of this is 1916 is the year that Ishi, the last California Indian, dies in captivity. He was found in a Sierra Nevada foothill town, naked and starving, and didn't speak English, and was brought to the county jail. And he was going to be prosecuted, and somehow he'd been being tracked by Alfred Kroeber, who was a very famous anthropologist at Berkeley. He had his graduate students out tracking sort of last Indian populations, and all of Ishi's family had been wiped out through genocides because during the gold rush era of 1850 to 1890 plus, up till the beginning of the turn of the 20th century, you could get money for killing Indians. It was encouraged by the government. It was an encouraged policy that a good Indian was a dead Indian. And so Ishi is a kind of traumatized child of that era. He doesn't speak English. Nobody actually knows his name. He's called Ishi, which is the name for man in a language that they think he's from. And he's brought to the museum. And Kroeber and his students clothe him, record him speaking, try to learn his language, give him a job as a janitor. at the museum observe him kind of like a zoo animal at all hours of the day. They have him build his own kind of hut, like what you would build to live in out of sticks and mud, and they put it on display. And Ishi ends up dying of tuberculosis in 1916. And so that's the other sort of end point or beginning point to my chapter and my book, is that the only way that the Park Service could have taken over all this land is by this ethnic cleansing and getting rid of California's First Nations, First Americans population. There are also a number of artists that I've tried to cover in this book who are lesser known, like Consuelo Kanaga, who's a real favorite of mine. She is one of the few women artists who works as part of the F64 group around Ansel Adams, but she's really underknown. But she's one of the first women to make pre-civil rights images, she's a white woman, of Black women and their children, to sort of bring a layer of dignity to observing them, to photographing them. And what she does that's quite radical is, because the F64 group are real techies, they are constantly calibrating their light sources. And her radicality is that she calibrates for Black skin. All of photography is calibrated for white skin. And you have to hold the exposure time much longer to get this level of detail that we see in Francis with the flower. And so that's a contribution that she makes during this era that then is kind of forgotten about. And she ends up in New York kind of destitute, but she's really an early pioneer in producing these images of women and children with this level of detail and dignity pre-war. Studio craft, and then I'm going to wrap up after a couple more slides here, but studio craft was initially going to be a standalone chapter. I am really a craft historian. I wrote my first book on ceramics, histories of women, in Black Mountain College, and one of my deep inclinations in this book is to bring back studio craft, and that is glass, metal and jewelry, furniture making, ceramics and pottery, and textiles and weaving back into the fore, because it's always shoved off to the side, either in the Deck Arts category or never considered in a survey text at all. And I was going to initially make it a standalone chapter, but instead I have taken the field at its word, that it wants to be integrated rather than ghettoized. So this meant for me reframing textiles as a feminist discipline rather than as simply a craft discipline. So usually when the crafts are written about, they're successively written about as all in a row, all 5 of them: jewelry, wood, metal, glass, ceramics. And I held back textiles from that. And I put them in dialogue instead with the feminist inclinations of the era, of the 1970s in particular, because you start to see the overlaps in terms of alternative community building. The only way you could be a feminist was to make your own alternative institutions. You were not welcomed into mainstream dominant art schools, and weaving was not welcomed into mainstream art programs. In fact, it was kicked out of Berkeley altogether. For a while, they put it in anthropology. That was Kroeber's old department. And then they got rid of it altogether, even though they had a great weaving program. And instead, a couple of enterprising former Berkeley students got together and formed an alternative program. It was not degree granting, but it was where you could learn to weave and learn weave structures and other kinds of textile production, called the Pacific Basin School of Textile Arts, that ran for 10 years and had a gallery space. And so when you see the kind of levels of organization, it's really interesting to see these overlaps. Here is the Feminist Studio Workshop, also not degree granting, but took place at the Women's Building as an alternative center of culture and as artistic production and also learning. This was co-founded by Judy Chicago. You also see early organizational efforts that the very first craft conference that happens in the United States actually happens in California, out on the Monterey Peninsula, because there's an acknowledgement in New York that so many craftspeople are originating from doing really great modernist work out in California. So that's how I ended up structuring these 2 chapters. Chapter 3 is abstraction as a framework, 45 to 65, and it covers hard edge painting, Bay Area abstraction, studio craft, woodworking, and then the chapter 5 is the isms chapter. I'm a little getting close to maybe over time, so I'm going to wrap up here and just give you these last 2 slides, which is that other times craft is working in tandem with cutting-edge sculpture, such as studio glass and light and space, and arguably both movements were invested in light as a primary medium, but the key difference in their receptions, or how they were received at the time, is that it becomes a problem of scale. Both of them are working through light. But this becomes room-sized installations, and Marvin Lepofsky is doing tabletop glass sculptures because he's blowing glass. And so the glass people never get the recognition that the light and space people do, but they're still producing the same kind of content in their work. And so that's what I'm trying to sort of bring back as a kind of revisionism that I'm calling as the sort of basis for this book. So I'm going to wrap here and take questions, comments, and I'm happy to continue talking out in the lobby as well.
So do any of you have questions here? You want to use the mic?
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that there was no line as to where the photographs are, where the source of the photographs. So I don't know these photographers.
Yeah, the photographs are, I think that one of these is at the Getty and one of these is at the Japanese American National Museum. Those are the 2 places that these artists are held in collection. It's the only 2 places that I'm aware of. Dennis Reed was a sort of amateur photographer who started buying up this work, and he left a portfolio to the Getty of this work that he had gotten from going around to people's nieces and nephews and grandchildren, trying to reconfigure this work. And there was a show he put on at the Japanese American National Museum maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, but it's locally held for the most part. And there is camera club work historically in other places. Seattle had a big camera club that was Japanese American. There were also white-only camera clubs, and I should just say that all camera clubs were men-only. So there's a kind of sexist parameter of the camera club era to begin with, that to be a woman holding a camera was already to be radical. But it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you talk a little bit more about the camera clubs and what the era, the timing of those was? And I ask because my grandmother was in one, so.
I'm not a camera club expert, so certainly women, I guess, joined later. The earliest era is usually considered about 1900 to about 1916. And then there's another generation of them that starts, like maybe 1916 to 1925. And then by the middle of the 20s and the 30s, camera work becomes much more popularized because it's being shown in galleries and magazines primarily. Alfred Stieglitz starts camera work as a magazine sometime during that era. I would have to look up the year. But sometime between 16 and 31, and he also runs a gallery called 291. Camera clubs, to my knowledge, were men only in this earlier part of the century.
Is this on? It is on.
Yes.
I'm very aware that you're not really talking about all of the paintings, the oils and the watercolors that were significant. You mentioned Laguna, San Diego, Santa Barbara, but a very significant amount of 20th century art is not spoken of here.
Yes, purposefully.
And because?
Because it's not that significant to many people anymore, because California Impressionism has been very well documented elsewhere. There's all kinds of books on California Impressionism. They're pretty stodgy, in my opinion, in the sense that they're, like Santa Barbara, this museum and my campus museum has great works by Frederick Lundgren. He was a local California Impressionist. All of them moved from the East Coast or Chicago or wherever and resettled for the light and the beauty. And it's not that I don't think it's significant, it's that I don't think it's as, it's not a social contribution in the kind that I'm trying to re-envision here, in the sense that those are all white people and they've been well documented. So other people have done that work. I don't need to redo that work. I need to elevate the BIPOC or the people of color and the queer people who've gone completely unrecognized under the radar for generations and their work has never been seen. So
were there minority artists that were working in the 30s and 40s and that you're not?
Sure, they were absolutely working.
And they were painting?
Of course, there's paintings by people of color throughout the entire century, but if you're a person of color, you face great disadvantage.
Are you teaching that period when you're teaching?
I teach the whole of the 20th century, yes.
So we're just not we can't see it all. Clearly, I appreciate that.
Yes, of course you can't see it all, but largely I do not focus on painting in my own teaching.
That's what I'm asking. Thank you so much.
Yes, you seem a little agitated by that.
No, you are.
I'm agitated.
You were very defensive. I was just wondering why it was missing from your presentation.
Because I don't think paintings, I think that to say that painting is missing is to already center painting as dominant. So that's what makes me slightly defensive, in the sense that I don't think painting is nearly as dominant as you might think it is.
Thank you.
Would someone like to ask a more docile question?
We don't have to be docile here.
Are you working on another book? I'm a big fan of your book.
Well, thank you. Yes, I'm working on a new book, but I also write a lot of exhibition catalog essays. So I just wrote for a painter named Amy Sherald in her first major monograph. She's the artist who painted Michelle Obama's portrait. I've just written on an installation textile artist of the 70s named Rosemary Mayer, who was a New York artist who was married to Vito Acconci, but is really underknown and largely didn't show outside of New York. What else have I done lately? A lot of other stuff, but I would say my next book is probably on textiles. You're welcome.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about art produced by the gay population during that time.
Which time?
During the time that you've,
Yes.
up 1916 going forward.
Yes. So while there's clearly always been gay artists, gay content hasn't really been as primary or as put forward since the dawning of the Stonewall movement. So most of the gay art production I look at starts in '69 forward. There are a lot of queer artists and trans artists who populate this book. It's a subject near and dear to my heart. Also, the first gay flag, the gay pride flag, was invented here in California by Gilbert Baker as a community effort at the San Francisco Gay and Lesbian Center. The colors were chosen by a group of people. There were many versions of the flag that were produced before the flag was finally adopted as a kind of rainbow. The trans movement has since adopted a series of colors that looks back to the gay pride flag. But the book is also populated with artists who don't necessarily make gay-forward work, but are gay and lesbian. I think that that's the other piece of this, is that everybody doesn't always identify openly in their artistic production as making queer art, even if they themselves identify as queer in some way.
Hi, great presentation.
Thanks.
Two things. One, I just have an ad as a former faculty of Brooks Institute of Photography here in town for 8 years and also a student to this day that school was on, there were still prejudice against women behind the camera. Just wanted to make a big note of that. And as faculty, I was one of 3 full-time female faculties compared to 20-odd. So moving on from that, I just want to say this sounds like a very huge passion project of yours, and I'm wondering if you might share your inspiration for delving into it with us.
That's a good question. I would say my commitment is really it started with students, teaching in California and seeing students who would endlessly think that they had to go somewhere else to see art, that there was no art in the state. That, you grow up surrounded thinking that nothing you're surrounded by is interesting because you're a teenager and you're sullen. But eventually you grow out of that and you realize, okay, there is some art here. But I just had an endless parade of students always in my office who wanted to go to New York, or they wanted to go to London, or they wanted to go to Paris. And they didn't understand that their own state was not only full of art, it was full of artists who had moved their lives here for, a century plus in order to take advantage of all the things that they were bored by. The sun and the light and the beach. And so I guess my passion grew out of trying to interest and incite passion in a kind of disaffected quasi-post-teenager that I work with.
Okay, first of all, I really appreciate that you do use the photography as part of art rather than a different media, and that you integrated it together and how it all went together. But my question is about another topic that you had, and it was when you talked about like the Native American and that topic, and here in Santa Barbara and around the Central Coast and some of the populations that we have as far as Native Americans and the original Americans that were here before, even the influx from the South. Did you find any of that to put in your book at all?
You mean locally from Santa Barbara?
Well, no, just as far as some of the, like the Chumash population and so forth. Did you find
Chumash is not mentioned in this book because most of the Chumash are genocided before the dates of this book.
Okay.
But so that would be Mission era for the most part. But all of Santa Barbara is built on unceded Chumash territory. And certainly I think that work is very important, and there's contemporary Native American artists that are all over this book, some of whom are painters, some of whom are weavers, and also I document the Red Power movement, which is really instrumental. There's a whole chapter that is just devoted to it's called Art as Power. It's about the social movements of the 60s. So the 60s, 68 through 78. And not just Black power and liberation politics, but how Black power transfers over and influences other ethnic minorities, particularly the Asian American movement, the Red Power or Native American occupation of Alcatraz, which happens here and is one of the instrumental ways in which AIM, or the American Indian movement, spreads culturally elsewhere. And so I think California is so central to being a space for, making space for radical politics. And being able to launch movements. And there are artistic pieces of that movement as well.
So I'm just gonna come to a conclusion here because I worry that you're not gonna have time to go to our bookstore to buy Jenni's book. And I also worry that she won't then have time to sign your book, and I hope that you will take a moment to speak with her personally and to thank her, as I want to thank you for coming to speak to us. And your book is delightful, and I think we're all quite proud to be a part of this culture and to be a part of its diversity.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Jen.